Hormones, hormones, hormones here and there. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Well, in our course we've been through adventures high and low. We talked about insulin, leptin that has a negative feedback to avoid us, making us grow. There's feedback loops and circuits that are beautiful to watch. And in this course, we'll study them a lot, perhaps too much. Hormones, hormones, hormones here and there. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Today, my friends, we'll go into the stress axis. I hope we can all relax and really love this. There's cortisol, a steroid hormone. It's going to be our first steroid hormones we discuss, and that can never hurt. Hormones, hormones, hormones here and there. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Hormones, 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 hormones everywhere. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Lecture 6, the stress axis. Let's take a nice deep sigh of relief to reduce our stress level and to welcome ourselves into the safe space of hormone circuits. And so far we've discussed leptin, the feedback loop that helps control our weight. And of course there are times we really fluctuate, but overall it seems there's a set point for our weight. And then we did 3 lectures, not 2, not 4, on the glucose insulin circuit, which helps keep homeostasis. That is to say, not a set point, which is different between people, the same between people, 5 millimolar. And we saw that happen using a circuit, a cool circuit, where a cell type makes a hormone that controls something, glucose, and that thing also, that signal also makes that cell grow and shrink, which solves the problem of organ size control, compensation of insulin resistance, and is prone to mutations, and therefore we have designs that make us prone to type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, how diseases arise. We solved all that using techniques of null clients and bifurcation plots. And now we're ready to go into a fascinating world of steroid hormones. And those hormones control the most important facets of mammalian life, talking about growth, sex, metabolism, and stress. They all come with these, they're steroid hormones through quite similar pathways controlled by the brain. And we're going to go through some of these pathways. I mean, in the next part of the course, we'll talk about the stress pathway, the sex pathway, the growth pathway, the thyroid pathway, and we will see their special design. In particular, from a theoretical point of view, we'll see what happens when you go from one cell type that has growth control to 2 cell types, 2 glands, 2 organs that control each other's growth. And the amazing thing we'll see in this talk is that when you have 2 glands growing, they can give you oscillations. You can have a clock inside your body, an oscillator, and that creates fascinating opportunities and problems. For example, we're going to link it towards the end of the lecture to bipolar disorder, mood disorders, which are really connected to the stress axis very tightly. So that's our plan, to talk about the stress axis. Take a nice deep sigh of relief. Welcome. Breath. So when we talk about stress, what is stress? Stress is a signal that threatens to take the body out of equilibrium. And that could be a physiological signal. For example, low glucose. That's a big stress because we can, as I said before, faint or die. Low blood pressure. Again, oxygen can't get to our organs. We can faint or die very quickly. An inflammation in the body. The body needs now to fight a pathogen. That's a kind of stress. These are all internal stresses. Other kinds of stresses are external. We see a truck coming toward us full speed. That's a stress. We also, human beings have psychological stress. We're worrying about whether we have an exam or some kind of relationship problem, or we have to take care of a sick parent. We're worrying. And that is also kind of stress. And the interesting thing is that for all these kinds of stresses, psychological stresses and internal stresses, the body has one major similar response to all of them. It's called the stress response. So of course, there's particular responses to low blood pressure, particular responses to low glucose, like the hormone glucagon. But there's also a general stress response for everything, including psychological stresses, and that's called the stress response. And it has a fast component and a slow component. The fast component works immediately within seconds. Adrenaline, it's basically the brain integrates the stress information, turns on the sympathetic nervous system that goes to the adrenal medulla, and there's secretion of adrenaline, and that makes your heart beat fast, and glucose is secreted, and blood vessels contract, and you get a lot of energy to deal with the truck. Let's say the truck is coming toward you, you want to jump out, run, fight, freeze, or fight or flight, right? Fight, freeze, or flight. The 4 F's: fight, freeze, fight, freeze, fly, or reproduce. All of these turn on the sympathetic nervous system, adrenaline. You have your blood pressure goes up. And that's fast. And then there's an additional one which takes care of minutes and hours, where you get full of the hormone cortisol. Hormone cortisol does the kind of minute to hour stress response. It's a small molecule that looks like a fatty acid. It's a cholesterol derivative. It's like a little bit of a fatty acid, and that's why it can go through the membranes of basically all the cells in your body. It goes from the blood to all the cells in your body. All cells in the body have receptors inside there for the steroid hormone, for cortisol, and it goes to the nucleus and causes genes to be expressed, as you see, proteins to be made that prepare the body for stress. It has preparation of glucose and focuses the mind and has overall effects to prepare you for stress. This is the cortisol. It also shuts off the immune system. He says, okay, right now we have to run away from the truck. Let's divert energy from immune system, body repair, stuff like that, because it's something more important. So cortisol is an immunosuppressant. And that's why it's also used medically, very important. These steroids, you might have heard, glucocorticoid steroids are drugs used to suppress inflammation. So if you have asthma or autoimmune disease, you get high levels of this cortisol analog, steroids like dexamethasone, to shut off the immune system. A very effective drug, but of course it has side effects. Some of those side effects, by the way, are mood disorders, mania or depression in a fraction of the people who get it, and that's a link that this cortisol is also linked to mood disorders. And when I say stress, I want to tell the difference between acute stress, which is very quick. So you see the truck, that's acute stress, and your cortisol levels maybe go from 100 to 300 units to 1,000. That's normal. And then after 90 minutes, they go back. And then there's chronic stress. Like if you're worried about something, that's almost a human thing, is to have a psychological confusion or perceptions about the world that you think like there's a truck going to hit you all the time. That's special for human beings. I'm not sure mice have it, and maybe if they're in a low on the hierarchy, on the status hierarchy, and they get pecked at all the time, they have chronic stress. Human beings have chronic stress when they're worried, and that causes over months symptoms. Too high, cortisol that's too high for months causes symptoms like weight gain, heart problems, high blood pressure, and psychological problems, anxiety and negative thinking, which are very bad. So chronic stress, of course, suppression of the immune system makes you more vulnerable to cancer, more vulnerable to inflammation, to pathogens, viruses, etc. So chronic stress is a big killer in the world. Probably the reason why people in the lowest income decile live 10 years less than people in the upper 10% across cultures, even with the same access to healthcare. It's just being low on the socioeconomic status hierarchy happens to be associated with chronic stress for a multitude of reasons. And so chronic stress is a very important problem in the world. Let's take a nice deep sigh of relief. Why do we take nice deep sighs of relief? Remember, it's because when we're relaxed, our breath is deep. When we take deep breaths, it actually relaxes the sympathetic nervous system, the adrenal system, and also our perceptions that this is actually a nice, safe class, and reduces our stress, which opens up our learning and memory. Anyway, take another nice deep sigh of relief. It's so much fun. Any questions so far? I'm going to stop till there's a question by chat. Now it's your turn to chat me a question. Who's going to be the first to dare to chat a question or comment? Oh, great. Thank you. Is stress a positive feedback loop? Stress leads to more stress. And what's the evolutionary cause if yes? Generally, it's not stress isn't a positive feedback loop unless you get into a psychological state. For example, people with clinical depression have a state where they interpret things negatively. So if you succeeded on a test, instead of saying, oh, I really prepared, you say, oh, the test was easy. So it's negative attribution, and that can create additional stress. So there's possibly psychological feedback loops that lead to more stress. I hope I answered your question. When is cortisol released? In response to stress or we anticipate stress? So cortisol is released both when we see stress and when we anticipate stress. And this question is a perfect question for the biology of the HPA axis, which is what controls cortisol release, and that's what I'd like to share with you. What is the human mechanism that causes special phenomenon? So the HPA axis I'll describe to you now is conserved across all vertebrates. Even the earliest vertebrates had the cortisol system or something like it. The special thing about human beings, or maybe primates, is that our ability to plan the future and think about the future can help us. It has been hooked up to the same stress response that in simpler organisms measures immediate threats and low blood pressure, etc. And that's why we can get into chronic stress by worrying about our image, like our profile on Twitter or whatever it is, like serious things, more trivial things. So, up to now, we discussed loop with half-lives of minutes. When I said seconds is very fast, like adrenaline is in seconds. So when you see seconds in biology, a lot of times in physiology, it's a neuron thing. So the brain has a whole nervous system for stress response called the sympathetic nervous system. It innervates the gut, the heart, the adrenal, everywhere. And it can make your palms sweaty. It can make your mouth dry. It makes your heart race. It makes your intestines stop digesting. So you get like butterflies in your stomach in order to reserve energy for other things. And that's a second response. Cortisol is a hormone thing. And so it takes minutes to hours. Is there a counter hormone to cortisol? I would say in counter to the sympathetic system is the parasympathetic system, which is relaxation. So when we take a nice deep sigh of relief, like right now, what we're actually doing is activating our parasympathetic nervous system. This is the nervous system of relaxation. It is on when we are not worried about anything. It actually helps our digestion. It helps our sleep. It helps us concentrate and learn. So there's always a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic. That's on the second time scale. When you have the parasympathetic system, your voice goes lower. When you're trying to soothe someone, you say, why don't you take a nice deep sigh of relief? And you're activating your own parasympathetic system, relaxing the muscles that make you breathe. Your voice goes lower, hoping, because we're like two oscillators, to entrain the other person and helping them breathe a little deeper and activate their parasympathetic system. That's how one person can actually help another person. On the other hand, if your sympathetic nervous system is on, maybe you activated in other people too, you know? I can't seem to face up to the facts. I'm tense and nervous, I can't relax. I can't sleep, my bed's on fire. Don't touch me, I'm a real live wire. Psychophysics, HPA. Fight, 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 freeze or run, run away. Whoa. Why? We'll move on with the HPA. So how does this work? So we have our brain. It all starts, so it's going to be the HPA axis. We have between our ears is a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. The names aren't so important. We're just going to call it H. It integrates stress input, which we're going to call U, the input. It could be, as I said, low blood pressure, low glucose, inflammatory signals, psychological stresses. And this gland H secretes a hormone we'll call X1. Its real name is CRH, corticotrophin releasing hormone, but we'll call it X1. To the next gland, the pituitary. It's sitting at the base of the brain. It's actually a master gland. It makes those hormones that control the effector hormones for sex, growth, metabolism. Here it's stress. So pituitary is a very important gland and secretes X2, which is called ACTH, adrenal cortex trophic hormone. Doesn't matter. We call it X2. And this goes to the adrenal. Now, the adrenal, we have two kidneys. On top of each kidney is a pyramid. It's really, really waxy. And its job is to produce steroid hormones. It produces several steroid hormones, but the most important one is cortisol. And there's a negative feedback loop where cortisol shuts off the production of X1 and X2. And that's cool. So that when it goes up, when the stress goes away, it also shuts down the upper layers. And this can explain a lot of things that happen on the minute time scale. For example, one of the inputs here is circadian, which means the 24-hour clock. In fact, the hypothalamus is sitting right close to the part of the brain, suprachiasmatic nucleus, I think it's called, where the brain circadian clock is sitting. And that's why when you look at over the day, cortisol is secreted when you wake up. When you wake up, it's secreted, gives you energy to wake up, and then it goes down. Maybe there's another peak during the afternoon, and at night it's pretty low. And without cortisol and adrenaline, we wouldn't have the power to get out of bed, let alone run 100 meters. So this is the cortisol circuit. It's, by the way, one puzzle I always think about is how the different inputs are integrated. How do you get, if you have a little bit of low blood pressure and a little bit of inflammation and some psychological stress, how are they all combined into this physiological output, which is the secretion of X1, CRH. It's secreted into a little private blood vessel, goes to the pituitary secretes into the circulation X2, circulation reaches the adrenal cortex, because the adrenal has a cortex that makes cortisol and a medulla that makes adrenaline. Adrenaline is made from nervous inputs, but also cortisol increases the sympathetic nervous system signal to make adrenaline. So there's a whole interplay. Okay, so we have the HPA axis. And what we want to focus on today is chronic stress. So what happens when you have a long problem? Not long, I don't mean minutes, and I don't mean day. I mean weeks. What happens when you have chronic stress? In order to do that, we're going to observe that this circuit has, in fact, the same motif as the glucose insulin circuit, but appears 2 times, one on top of the other. The reason is that these cells here, in the pituitary and adrenal, just like the beta cells, they're cells that secrete hormone. They also divide and are removed with a time scale of about a month. And that immediately tells you that something needs to have organ size control. What controls the size of the cells? What makes them grow exponentially or shrink? And it turns out that the regulation is that X1 not only makes the pituitary secrete X2, it also makes the amount of cells grow. And X2 is not only a hormone that makes the adrenal secrete cortisol, it's also a growth factor that makes the adrenal grow. And it's well known that during chronic stress, the adrenal is large. And that's in fact how this whole pathway was first discovered by Celia in the 30s, looking at rats and exposing them to all kinds of stresses and seeing that no matter what he did, he had the same physiological responses. And one of them was the large of this adrenal gland. And they said, oh, what's this gland do? And later on, it turned out it makes cortisol and several other hormones. That's a big step in endocrinology in the 1930s. So people who commit suicide, post-mortem, they have a large adrenal gland. Or people who have been stressed, people with depression, large adrenal gland and high cortisol. People under chronic stress. A nice deep sigh of relief. All right. So there's two, and I'm going to write it like this. I'm going to write it like this so that you can see what I mean when I say 2 versions of this circuit. We have X2 causing the P to secrete, X1 causes P to secrete X2. But X1 also makes these cells grow. And adrenal secretes X3 under control of X2, but X2 also makes the adrenal grow. So you see it's two versions of the circuit. And because of this negative feedback loop, X3 shuts off X1 and shuts off X2. So that's a pretty complicated circuit, right? So maybe a few weeks ago, before you started this course, it was very difficult to understand the circuit. But with everything we did in this course, and we're going to be able to understand it in about 7 minutes, you'll be able to see what the circuit does that's special. That's my goal, anyway. And that special thing is 2 glands controlling each other's size. It's going to give us an oscillator that has time scale of months. What could be the benefits of being stressed in relationships? That's a good question. I leave it to you. Is that true that more cortisol release among athletes? Athletes have a beautiful thing that together with X2 is released beta endorphin. So when you exercise, in fact, the body turns on this axis in an optimal way and releases beta endorphins, which is like morphine. It makes you euphoric and have less pain. X2 is actually cleaved from a peptide. Its other half is endorphin, so that you get both stress response and pain relief and euphoria. That's one of the addictive things about exercise. I would say that, in fact, if this is cortisol, low amounts or high amounts, and this is bad and good for your physiology, roughly speaking, cortisol effects are biphasic. If it's too low, you can die from having too little energy, your blood pressure drops, and that's called the Edisonian crisis, and it's deadly if you have too low. If you have too high for long periods of time, as I said, you have chronic stress, heart problems, etc. Right in the middle is optimal stimulation, and that's what you want, let's say, when you exercise or when you do something you really love and you're good at, and time flies and passes, and you get a lot of this beta endorphins, and so it's a kind of I would call it actually a kind of a navigation system that tries to take the organism towards this point where if too high cortisol, you get depressed and you have very low energy and you basically stop the behavior. So if your behavior is stimulating you too little or too much, cortisol effects gives you such low energy that you probably change, in a way you change what you were doing. For instance, in baboons, if you try to fight the alpha male and you lose, you get depressed. And that's very good for the baboon because they stop trying to fight the alpha male and basically killing themselves. And then after a while, maybe they go back to more better behavior in terms of cortisol. So it's kind of a navigation system, I see it, for understanding how to behave in a complicated world. Coffee, good point. What does coffee do? I invite you to Google it. Coffee, HPA axis, adrenaline, coffee. Coffee is interesting. Maybe it's good for the exercise. Training, meditation training. So the meditation training, I'll talk about meditation training. And if I don't, I'll tell you, I'll get to that. Okay, HPA axis. So we have these glands grow and shrink. So how do we make sense of that? And the way we make sense of that is that we notice that what's going on here, right? What's going on here is the following. P gland makes the hormone to make A grow. So I'm going to talk about here about the slow time scale of months. The P gland makes the A gland grow by secreting this X2. It's a growth factor. A gland makes X3 that shuts off X1, which is the growth factor for P. So more A, more X3, the less X1, and therefore less P growth. By X3 shutting off X1. Cool. Okay. So we have here a feedback loop of two glands. Okay? But they take months to grow. So there's a delay. Now, when you have a feedback loop with a delay, it's a little bit like the shower I had when I was growing up. It's supposed the water, I would go in, I would turn on, the water was really cold. So I make it very hot, but there was a delay. I went more hot, and then, it was really hot, so I turned it to cold, and it was a delay, cold and hot. Cold. So when you have a feedback loop, I was like the feedback loop, and the delay, it makes a kind of oscillations. Can you relate to that? So let's just try to figure out what will happen here. Suppose I start with a large A and a large P. A large A and large P. So let's say they can't grow anymore even. The thing that will happen is A will make P go shrink. When P shrinks, A shrinks because P makes A grow, so there's not enough X. But now A is small, so P grows. But now P is large, so A grows. This is a kind of qualitative argument. So you see there's a kind of a cycle. And because each step here takes an order of months, this entire cycle takes about 1 year. There's another, mathematically, there's another 2 pi term there when you solve it that turns months into a year. And when Avichai Tendler was my PhD student, solved this problem and saw this year timescale, we got goosebumps because we understood that the year timescale is really important for human beings, like seasonality. Later, we saw the disc can entrain with the seasons, give you a seasonal clock. And we were quite excited about also moods. The timescale of moods is months and years. And so we were really interested in understanding this as an oscillator. And I want to give you one more tool to understand the HPA axis as an oscillator. And that tool, again, is using the idea of a phase portrait and null lines. So I'm going to draw here P and A. So remember, the null lines are easy to draw if you think, okay, I'm now going to fix a certain amount of P and ask how much A I'm going to have at steady state. That's the idea of null line, right? Fix P and see A in steady state. So if I increase P, the steady state A will be larger and larger. You agree? So it looks like this. The other null line is I fix A, and I see what happens to P at steady state. The larger A, the smaller P is at steady state. Because A makes cortisol that inhibits X1, which is the growth factor for P. So this looks like this. And we have a nice fixed point, which is when both of them are at steady state, and that's the fixed point. This is familiar to you. But now I'm going to add something new that we didn't do before, which is, I mean, what we did up to now is in the null lines, if we started something, one variable, let's say, leptin was or eating was much faster than the other one, fat, and we would fly to one of the null lines and crawl on it. So up to now we had a kind of thing where we would fly and crawl. That's because there was separation of timescales. But now there's no separation of timescales because both these glands take a month or so. That's their turnover time. So we have really different dynamics. And in order to do that, we can draw a little arrow at each point. Let's say we start with certain A and P and see what happens. Where does it go? That's a phase portrait. To help us along, we can use an interesting feature of these null lines. This null line here is dA dt equals 0. This is the steady state. So I fix P and I see what's the steady state of A. Since A is not changing, I'm guaranteed that only P is changing on the null line. So on the null line, the arrows are always parallel. On the other null line, P isn't changing. So I set up A and see what's the steady state P. And because P isn't changing, the arrows have to be vertical. If that was fast, you can read about it in the lecture notes. I just want to show you that this gives us a kind of a swirly shape to the arrows. We already know for free that the arrows have a swirly shape. And in fact, they have a shape that looks like this. They have like this is called a spiral fixed point. Because the flow spirals into it. And that's another way of saying that there's a kind of an oscillatory thing here. So this was just plotted by Moria Raz, who's a PhD student in the group. And so we have this kind of, with the null lines, we can quite quickly, we don't even need to write equations, get a kind of feeling for what's going to happen here. For example, if I start here, I'm going to have pituitary grow, and then adrenal grow, and then go back to baseline. So we can see at one look at this arrow diagram, this phase portrait, we can understand a lot about the dynamics. And since this is, these oscillatory dynamics are so important, I'm going to give you another intellectual tool to think about them. Not only this oscillator kind of picture, growing and shrinking, or the null lines, I'm going to give you an analogy, which is for me very useful. I love doing science with analogies. I think that's the only way, actually, as scientists, we can go into the unknown, because if we're ignorant about something, we can say, well, maybe it's like, maybe the mind is like a computer. And then, of course, we don't mean that it's made of silicon, but maybe it has a memory unit, for instance. So we entail some properties onto the thing we don't know. So I'm going to give you another metaphor that's very useful for me, and that is of a spring or mass on a spring. So you have a spring and a mass, and here it is sitting in equilibrium. And I'm going to pull on the spring. X is the displacement. When I pull on the spring, there's a force pulling back. Right? So this force causes a velocity v that makes me, when I come back, when I release the spring and come back to equilibrium, it's not with zero velocity. It goes like this, and then it compresses the spring, and that pushes the weight back. So you get the kind of oscillation. So you have, if you extend the spring, you get velocity, and velocity compresses the spring back. And therefore, when you solve this problem, you get oscillations. it turns out that our system, when you solve it on the computer, doesn't oscillate forever. It has what's called damped oscillations, as you can see here. They stop. They don't go around forever. So we have time adrenal, let's see. Damped oscillations. So in order to make a good analogy, we're going to imagine that our spring is sitting in a container. And this container has some viscous material. Maybe like honey or something like that. And now if I take the spring, it'll go woo and stop. So this is going to be our analogy. A spring inside a viscous material. Why is this a damped oscillator, you might ask? It's because the adrenal also inhibits its own growth factor, X2. So adrenal is a little bit inhibiting itself, and pituitary is also a little bit inhibiting itself because it makes X2 that makes X3 and X3. So there's this damping term. Just like the more velocity you have in the honey, the more drag you have. So that's why there's a damped oscillation. All right, take a nice deep sigh of relief. So this theoretical part set us up to ask what happens now in real life, medical and physiological situations. Now we know that we have two glands. One makes the other grow. The other one makes the first one shrink. What happens? What kind of interesting properties can that have? Okay, so the question are, what seasons are with high A? So it turns out that the peak season, and you can read this in Alon Bar, your paper in PNAS 2021. By the way, what Alon did was take big medical data. Clalit Healthcare gave Weizmann access to 50 million life years of anonymized medical data. And Alon took blood tests for cortisol and many other hormones and looked what's the average per month of year, taking care to remove people who had diseases that affect the hormone or drugs that affect the hormone according to the same data set. I mean, so you can, for each drug, you can see if it affects the hormone. So you take away all people with clinical situations that might affect the hormone count. And he found that human sex, growth, reproduction pathways all peak in late winter, early spring. It's a small effect of a few percent, but it's very significant. And so that's the place where you expect to have human, at least in our latitude, peak. In Australia, if you look at cortisol, it's also in winter, but it's 6 months different because Australia is in the southern hemisphere. And if you look at other countries, in Sweden, where day and night fluctuations are, it's the day and night, the day length that's the signal for seasonality. The day length, so if I was to give you a metaphor, if you take the spring in the honey and now oscillate it like this with a 12-month period, the spring picks up that 12-month and starts oscillating with it, but maybe out of phase. So indeed, cortisol is out of phase with the shortest day of the year. Doesn't peak in December 21st, it peaks in February because of this 2-month delay. And X2 is out of phase with X3, again, because of like velocity and position. So all these things support this model, and which also hints where the circuannual clock is. So if you take different animals, of course, they can migrate in spring, like birds can migrate in spring and in fall, change their fur, have breeding seasons. And even when you keep the animals in constant day length and temperature conditions, they still have this seasonality. But it's not 12 years, it's a lot of time, 12 months, it's a lot of times it's 10 months. So it's circuannual. They have an internal clock with, let's say, a 10-month periodicity, just like we have an internal clock with 25-hour periodicity, circadians, about a day. And this can suggest that this oscillator could be keeping the time where all kind of noise makes it into a undamped oscillator. I'll tell you about that in a second. So That kind of seasonality work uses large-scale medical data. From Clalit to show that X3 is a function of month. This is December 21st. Looks like this. So this is, let's say, February. So there's this delay, 2-month delay from the shortest day of the year. And X2 peaks in summer, so it's out of phase. And you can't get that unless you have something like glands that change size, because otherwise the hormones just have like minutes delays between them. And so you can't get an antiphase like that unless you have something hidden variable that's changing over the years. And Alon also used brain imaging to show that the pituitary gland size changes with the season in the predicted way. So that gives some support to this oscillation idea. So peak season around late winter, early spring for a lot of things that human beings, maybe other mammals, need to do. By the way, these oscillations are very small in Israel. There are maybe 30%, 40% amplitude in Sweden, where days are much shorter and longer in summer and in winter and summer. In Israel, it's very small. So we're not going to talk about mood swings, which are much, much bigger than seasonality. Seasonality, you have to average over tens of thousands of people in order to see the signal in Israel. But mood swings could be much larger and don't have a season, etc. So I just want to say that ahead of time. Seasonal affective disorder. Yes, seasonal affective disorder. So in Scandinavian countries, in Alaska, etc., there's a 10% for winter blues. It happens in late winter, and the peak of suicides is in the spring. And so it's 10% in Alaska and 1% in Florida because of the driving force. The seasonal driving force is so much larger there. And so now it's called the seasonal component of mood disorders. There's no more, this seasonal affective disorder is no longer a thing. So what happens with a human being goes from the north hemisphere to the south hemisphere, this model will show that there'll be like a year of acclimation as your glands change phase. So that's very interesting. Maybe some people here have felt what it's like to go from a cold climate to a warm climate and how long it takes to adjust. So great questions. And let's take a nice deep sigh of relief. And now we're making good time. So what we're going to do now is first look at the list of topics we've covered. We talked about the HPA axis, X1, X2, and X3, this biphasic effect of cortisol. Compensation I didn't talk about, but that'll be in the lecture notes. Null clines, oscillator, the mass on a spring analogy. And now we come to, I want to talk about two medically important topics. One is bipolar disorder. We'll do that at the end. And the other one is what happens when you take steroid hormones for a long time and then stop. It's called steroid withdrawal. So these glucocorticoid steroids like dexamethasone, as I said, are very common drugs. You sometimes take them at very high levels. If the equivalent to physiological level is 2 milligrams per day, let's say for a certain person, sometimes you need to take 40 or 60. Why? Because of autoimmune disease or asthma or something with a lot of inflammation, or COVID-19 critical illness, you want to reduce inflammation, you take cortisol, really reduces inflammation. You take the steroids. It also helps, like if your lungs are full of water, it helps the body takes the water away. That's because inflammation means your blood vessels kind of open up and fluid and cells from the blood go to fight pathogens. So cortisol stops that, and you can clear edema. Like people used to think that cortisol is a miracle drug because it made so many diseases better. But pretty soon, there were pretty bad side effects cropped up. Some things like depression and mania in some patients that I already mentioned. Also, salt imbalance and all kind of swelling issues, paradoxically. Weight gain. So sometimes people on steroids start eating like with the leptin system, like there's no more control on eating and you can gain a lot of weight. Depends, each person has different side effects. So you'd like to take steroids as low dose and as minimal time as possible. If you take it for less than 2 weeks, generally, you can stop it and no problem. But if it goes beyond 2 weeks, you can't just stop. If you just stop, you have a crash where the body is no longer able to make its own cortisol, and you get into this low state where you have problem with blood pressure. It could be lethal. It feels horrible. That's why you have to taper. Steroid withdrawal. You need to taper, which is to reduce the drug, let's say 25% every 2 weeks. Right, so you go from 40 milligrams to 30 milligrams every. Otherwise, your body is not able to make the cortisol it needs. So how can we understand the steroid withdrawal? What I'm going to show you is that when you take steroids, it's like pulling the spring. It shrinks your adrenal. If you take steroids for a long time, the body, you have such high extra drug here, steroids, that it shuts off X1 and X2. Starts off X1, so the pituitary shrinks, and can make X2, and it shuts off X2. So the adrenal starts shrinking. So over months, you have your adrenal shrinks, and your pituitary shrinks. And where do you go? You go here. On long time steroids. And now, suppose they do the experiment, I stop taking steroids all at once. Let's see what happens according to this null claim thing. You follow this trajectory over months. First, the pituitary grows, then the adrenal grows, and there's an overshoot and you return. Or if I look at it like this, you have tiny A and P. And you stop taking them. So the pituitary grows, then the adrenal grows, and then they get to normal. And that's like almost a year. And when you take a look at data, what you see is that cortisol, so I took the steroids and now I stop. Cortisol is very low and stays low for like 9 months. And then it starts returning to normal. This is a situation where this is like not a large scale medical data. This is small scale medical data. In the early days of developing these steroid drugs, a medical group took patients and gave them very, very little cortisol, actually, just to get them through. And they did this, what's called the natural course, without tapering. So these people, or another situation is when your adrenal has a tumor that secretes X3 without control. That's called Cushing's disease. And if you take out this tumor, it's like stopping to take steroids. So it's another situation. Whereas X2, ACTH, also started low, but then had this massive overshoot before returning. So X2 is made by the pituitary. So this follows the same trajectory. And that's indication, again, we're on the right path here. You have this, it's like taking the spring, pulling it, and it goes boom. That's a single pull. The other evidence is seasonality. As I told you, you oscillate with the ear frequency, the spring picks it up, and you have this antiphase between X2 and X3. So we can have pretty good confidence in this model. And we can use this confidence to go into the unknown, into the big, big problem of psychiatry. You start a conversation, you can't even finish it. He's talking a lot, but you're not saying anything. When I have nothing to say, my lips are sealed. Sing something once, why sing it again? Psychophysics, HPA. Fight, 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 freeze or run, run away. Whoa, why? Let's take a nice deep sigh of relief and use the last part of this lecture after looking at steroid withdrawal to talk about mood disorders. Why do we have moods? What is mood disorders and what is bipolar disorder and how can we use this understanding to understand mood disorders? All right, that's the plan. All right. So we all have moods. Moods, we can be up or down. These moods last for weeks. An evolutionary psychologist thinking about moods think that might be evolved so that in nature, you might be in a situation where it's advantageous now to have low energy and actually not take initiative. Those are low moods. Other periods that can last for weeks might be when you do need to take initiative and have a lot of energy. And so it makes sense for something in the body to have momentum. And so if it's a low period, to stay low, even if you have like an outlying stimulus which says go high. Did I explain myself? So that's why we have moods according to evolutionary psychology. Of course, these theories need to be explored. And as I said, animals like baboons and stuff have moods. If you stress mice for a long time, they go into depression. And again, high activation of the HPA axis makes the adrenal and pituitary very large. And then when you stop, it takes some time to go back. And so there's all kind of effects like that. Or now that we're exiting COVID, maybe we're stressed for a long time, we'll have this kind of trajectory with its own issues. So it's okay for a few months if you don't feel normal like you used to. That's your glands need time to adjust in your psychology too. But what about mood disorders? So we all have high and low moods, but when I say mood disorders, I mean something much different. Major depression is a situation that disrupts your work relationship. It's the inability basically to feel emotions, anhedonia, with very low energy, usually. Sleeping problems, weight problems, etc. About 50% of people with major depression have high cortisol and enlarged adrenal. And conversely, as I said, taking steroid hormones, high cortisol effectively, gives a lot of people depressive symptoms. Cushing's disorder due to a tumor that makes cortisol. One of the big side effects, along with weight gain, high blood pressure, is depression. So we know that people with depression have high cortisol, and high cortisol can give you depression. Again, there's a genetic predisposition, so not everyone with high steroids will get depression, for sure. There's also a genetic predisposition. It's a debilitating disease, and maybe 10% of the world population has it. So it's huge. Major depression. I'm thinking maybe to add a lecture about major depression and the HPA and how we can understand it. What I want to do today is talk about a different mood disorder, bipolar disorder. Which was formerly known as manic depression. It was known as manic depression because people with bipolar disorder about 1% of the world's population, amazingly. So you're guaranteed to know someone who has a family member with bipolar disorder, almost for sure. Is a situation where you can experience a period of at least a week of mania. Mania is very high energy, not being able to sleep, almost sleepless nights, and making decisions which aren't well thought out, so you can take all your money out of the bank and buy jewelry for everyone on the street or something like that. The mania, before that, there's hypomania, which can be very pleasant and creative. The mania, a lot of times, burns bridges, burns relationships, and is very bad. And after the mania, a lot of times, there's depression, and you can go into months or years of very low depression with low energy, inability to feel positive emotions, etc. So bipolar has this cyclic nature. There is a subset that have, let's say, 4 events like this per year. That's called cyclic bipolar, which is more rare. A lot of people with depression, once you get in one mania episode, which is very stereotyped, and I mean, you can have, by the way, people with bipolar could be very high functioning. They can be running a $1 billion company or homeless on the street. The mania has many aspects that look very similar, the way they behave. So we're talking about moods that maybe go like this in a typical person, and maybe you have a mania and depression. Oh, of course, people with bipolar can spend a lot of time what's called balanced. But then once in a while, a lot of times following a stressful event or a very happy event, you can have a mania, depression. Okay, so a lot of it is in the brain, and it's basically in psychiatry is the one part of medicine where very little is understood compared to other kinds. So for instance, if we have a glucose blood test for diabetes, there's no blood test to tell you if you have depression or manic or bipolar disorder. It's all based on, till today, 2021, it's based on interviews. So you have a scale for mania, a scale for depression. They're 2 different things. You can have mixed states, etc. The medication usually comes from discovery, like anti-epileptic medicine, like lithium. Also, why? It helps with bipolar disorder. Or SSRIs against depression. Oh no, if we give people with bipolar, it can instigate a manic episode. So if we can make progress on physiological mechanism, blood tests, etc., in any psychiatric disorder, it would be a huge step forward. And HPA axis is definitely associated with bipolar disorder. It's dysregulated in people with bipolar disorder and in depression. There's also brain things, but let's try to see if we can separate brain and body to make like a very simple model for our discussion. So our goal will be to explain the time scale of weeks and months. Can we explain not everything about bipolar disorder, but where this time scale can come from? Because we know the neurotransmitters and neurons work seconds. We talked about like the sympathetic nervous system. Where do weeks and months come from? And this oscillatory nature maybe connects with this oscillatory nature that I'm talking about of the glands. So I hope that makes sense. All right, so we're going to make a little model. This is also a little bit of psychoeducation about the human being. Okay, so we're going to think about a human being as follows. We're going to think about the human being like this. We have life events. And we see the life events, but the life events don't automatically activate the HPA axis. How do I know? Suppose a political candidate wins. Some people are happy, some people are sad, some people don't care. So it's not the life event. There's something in the middle, and that something in the middle we call perception. So it's your brain makes sense of the event, right? It has to do with your history, your values, your beliefs, your post-trauma, all these things. So the perception makes the hypothalamus regard this as a stress or not. And that activates you, that goes into the HPA. That makes cortisol. Chronic stress, as I said, makes the mind more anxious, relieves the brakes on the amygdala, etc. So chronic stress can affect perception, and perception can affect behavior that affects life events. So this perception is a very strange thing, like the Zen koan says. And meditation and psychotherapy work on perception. So talking cures and meditation help you separate life events from your interpretation of them. And good therapy or good meditation can help you, give you like a second where you say, okay, let's not react automatically, but I have choice to have a different reaction. That's why I really recommend psychotherapy. I mean, I did lots of times in my life, several times psychotherapy, very helpful. And I also recommend meditation. Meditation, by the way, there's a great app called Waking Up by Sam Harris. That's a scientist, it's a neuroscientist who's also a meditation expert, and he takes away all the bullshit and gives you just very good advice, or a very good meditation practice, like 10 minutes you can do in the morning. Very, very important for graduate students, for scientists, so that we can look at the data with a fresh mind and we can communicate with each other with more freedom to decide how we're going to react. So if we take this model, we can next say that, and this is also psychological knowledge, bipolar disorder is associated with more reactivity to life events. That means the highs are higher and the lows are lower, just the reactions. Right? So if we take that as a given, something about the perception hardware, software of people with bipolar disorder, this could be a genetic inclination, because you can imagine that there's a trade-off between people who are very reactive because they might be able to respond quickly and save the whole group, and people who are not so reactive, more like even, because maybe in other situations they're going to save the group. So there could be that we have a genetic, again, genes that push us in this direction, variation in genes push us in this direction. We all get a bag of genes, and some of us are just on the outlier, and then we consider to have a disorder. So bipolar disorder, more reactivity, and therefore what we can imagine is the following. Our stress input, U, let's say this isn't a typical person. This is in bipolar, person with bipolar, because of this extra reactivity. I'm going to assume that. Now, what does this do to this? So now what I'm doing is I'm jiggling the input. So I'm going to propose to you to take our metaphor and put our spring in honey on the back of a truck. And this truck is now riding on a rocky road. Right? But if the truck is running on a smooth road, the spring is going to, if it's on a rocky road, the spring is going to pick up the oscillations. What is going to be its typical frequency? Minutes? Hours? Days? No. It's going to pick up its typical frequency, which is months. This kind of spring, as we said, has months. So if I look at cortisol, time in months, if typically we have fluctuations like these, this is not seasonal fluctuations. Seasonal fluctuations are tiny on this scale, okay? 3%. I'm talking about 20%. People with bipolar expect to see bigger. And maybe this person also has the genetic disposition where we cross a threshold of very high cortisol, we can get mania or depression. So that gives you a time scale for larger mood swings on the order of months because of the glands. I just want to finish up by telling you that we took this theory seriously, and we have an experimental project in the group to try to follow cortisol over time in people typical and people with bipolar diagnosis. Before I do that, I just want to say that when you have a spiral fixed point like that, this is for people interested in this, there's really damped oscillations. But if you add noise to the system, like noise input, the noise kicks you away from the spiral fixed point, and you start oscillating around the spiral fixed point. Your typical frequency is the frequency of this rotation. It's given by the imaginary part of the eigenvalue around the fixed point, for those of you that know linear theory. Its amplitude has to do with how much noise there is. So people with bipolar, if this noise, the noise here is this stress input, is larger, you have larger fluctuations. And that's how a damped system with noise actually becomes a noisy oscillator. This is for any system with a spiral fixed point, and noise will give you noisy oscillator. There's plenty of examples of that in biology, including the P53 transcription factor that oscillates in a noisy way with MDM2. It's anti-guy in an antiphase, and so this is a phenomenon I think across biology. So what experiment did we do? This is the work of Lior Maimon and Tomer Milo, following up on modeling work by Omer Karin, Avichai Tendler, Alon Bar, Uri Arad. So what they wanted to do is to follow, how can we measure cortisol over, let's say, a year? And you can take blood tests, but those are very sensitive. You need to do it over the year, and it matters what hour of the day you do it, because cortisol is circadian rhythm. You can take saliva, and that also sensitive only for an hour or something. You can take urine, which collect urine for 24 hours and get a time point. That's good, but you need to do that, let's say, every month or 2 months. That's a hassle. There's a much easier way, which is to take hair. So it turns out that if you take a hair, cortisol comes from the blood and diffuses into the hair and just sits there. There's no physiological role for this. It's just a side effect. It sits inside the hair, being a fatty kind of thing. It just sticks there and stays there. And now hair grows 1 centimeter every month, and that's more or less constant between people. So if you have 12 centimeters of hair, you have 1 year, and you look across the hair, you cut it into pieces, you basically get a chronological record of cortisol 1 year into the past, like tree rings almost. You need, in order to use antibodies to detect cortisol. So to do that, you need like a pencil width group of hair from the back here that doesn't leave any sign. Lior cut it up into pieces of 2 centimeters, and so you get 6 time points across the year. And then you can look what frequencies there are. So in controls, people typical, you get that there's an amplitude of about 20% on average of mood swings or cortisol swings going up and down. And if you look at the frequencies, so these are frequencies, this is what's called Fourier analysis. And so it asks what frequencies are in the signal. So this is the frequencies of 1 per year, 1 per 6 months, 1 per 3 months. You get that people indeed have slow frequencies. Frequencies of a year are typical. And when she looked at people with bipolar disorder, this is preliminary data, it's only about 30 people. They had larger fluctuations and long, also year-length fluctuations. This tells you what's the contribution of year-length fluctuations, shorter fluctuation. So it looks like this picture, at least in this small sample, is consistent. The people with bipolar have long wavelength fluctuations, just like people with control without bipolar, but just higher amplitudes. Something like twofold higher amplitudes, or a little bit less than twofold. And so how can this help us with bipolar? Again, bipolar, a large fraction of people with bipolar have a high probability of suicide and all kind of problems, health problems, because of the disease. The way forward could be, this is something I dream about, is to stabilize these oscillations using a controller. Controller is a machine, just like you have insulin pumps that pump insulin to control glucose, to have a situation where you take basically cortisol in order to stabilize its own fluctuations. The idea is like a swing. Anybody who's ever ridden on a swing knows that if you start, you don't have your dad or mom to push you, you can at the bottom start kicking your legs and you can start swinging. In the same situation, you can also stop swinging. Actually, if you kick your legs right when you're highest, you slowly stop swinging. Do you know this? So the idea is to give the cortisol the right phase to stabilize the oscillation. So controller, measure X3, take X3 according to the model, and do that again. And the goal is to convert the blue into the black. And actually, paradoxically, what that means is that when cortisol is highest, you should take a little bit more. I'm not talking about dexamethasone, which is very strong cortisol. Take a little bit of hydrocortisone, giving to people with low cortisol, medically approved drug, just a little bit of it. And according to the computer simulation, once you start taking, you start stabilizing. Controller. So with this model, you can, a little bit like also like pregnancy pills, anti-pregnancy pills, if you know what the phase is, you know what pill to take. So you can imagine measuring cortisol and saying, okay, for the next month, take pill number 7, measure again, maybe with hair, measure pill, and guide these fluctuations. Of course, this might not resolve bipolar disorder, or it might do, depending how causal these fluctuations are for bipolar disorder. And that's an experimentally testable proposition. All right, so I hope you agreed with me that it's fun to study the HPA. It's fun to study the HPA. It's got everything for your stressful needs. It's got equations and feedback loop feeds. It's fun to study the HPA. It's fun to study the HPA. We talked about what happens when you have two versions of this cell size control circuits working with similar timescales. They give you an oscillator. This oscillator can be trained by the seasons. It can give you overshoots and when you do steroid withdrawal. And when you have noise, it can give you persistent mood swings and maybe larger mood swings in bipolar disorder. It's still mysterious how you get major disorder for, you can be years, and how you resolve it. We may have a lecture about that. We use NOC lines and a face portrait in order to make progress. In the lecture notes, you can see all the math. I wish you a relaxed rest of the week. And let's take a nice deep sigh of relief. And see you next week.